Hi, welcome to mediatorpodcast.com, a podcast and video series about negotiation, mediation, and for today's little session, we're going to talk about toxic spouses. So, a lot of what I've been watching online and social is that everybody believes that you can't mediate with a toxic spouse, or they're very concerned that if you're dealing with a narcissist or somebody who doesn't have the capability of understanding how to communicate in a proper fashion, that mediation will just fail. And for the most part, people think that mediation fails when we get into these high conflict divorces. And usually those are also high net worth, because if you don't have money to fight about or valuations to argue about, then the odds are you're going to be smooth sailing into divorce court and you're going to be done very quickly. So for the rest of us who are involved with high conflict divorces, the divorce process could look a little bit longer. And so it could be 6 to 12 months before things even get started, because the other side, the toxic spouse, is going to delay and distract us. And what that means is they're just going to prevent you from having access to all the financial records or documents. And they're going to do it in a very slow fashion. So you're going to be going to hearings, you're going to be filing motions of contempt and other things. But the reality is the divorce court is not governed by police. And so no one's going to stop your toxic spouse from refusing to give documents, and no one is going to force them to give everything. So even when they do give documents, they're going to leave out missing pieces. So now you're in a situation where you got to figure out, how do you proceed? And for the most part, mediation is one way that you can start to control some of the process. And by control the process, it just means that you are moving it out of a litigation setting, a courtroom setting where a judge is overseeing everything. And realistically, the judge isn't going to do anything until the trial date. And so if you don't even have a trial date right now, how are you going to get things moving? Now, what we know is that you will continue to pay retainers to your attorney, your experts, everybody who is involved, maybe even a GAL or a guardian ad litem. And each time you may be paying for new real estate appraisals or new business valuations. And so, one way to get around some of those costs is to try to get everyone to sit down to mediation. Now, if you believe or if you've been told by your team that mediation is not an option, or you will not be successful, or you need to pick a certain mediator in order for anything to happen, that's just not the case. And this is coming from 20 years of experience, not only fighting things in court and really defending my valuation in courtrooms around the country, but it's also 10 years of doing mediation. And quite frankly, at the beginning of doing mediations, I thought the same thing. I thought that you would just go in and, it was sort of like the luck of the draw. If we got a good mediator, if we had some of the right documents, that we would be successful. My opinion of that has drastically changed in the past year or two, when we've really had to work with individuals so that they could have a good mediation strategy, because maybe their team was not listening to them. And maybe their team doesn't have that much experience in mediation, or understands that there is a strategy and there is a psychology that of patterns that happen in all of these mediations, specifically when we're dealing with high conflict or high dollar situations. For the most part, you're going to be fighting about a few key central aspects. You're going to be arguing about the value of the house or the business or the pension. You're going to be claiming that there are separate assets. So one person is saying that the business or the property was separate and therefore not to be divided in this divorce, which means they don't want you to get half of it. The other situation could be if they're hiding assets, or they're depleting assets, and that could be a marital waste claim. So there was money in the bank, savings or investment accounts, and it's no longer there, right? So you don't know where it went. Typically, this coincides with either addiction issues or infidelity, or other relationships that one party is spending money on. So these are the key areas that are going to keep people kind of in that phase of not disclosing all the documents and not allowing your team to have a full picture. And when a lawyer or an expert doesn't have a full picture and they don't have all of the documents necessary, they could claim that there's not enough information to determine the value or determine a settlement offer. And quite frankly, what we're looking at in all of these cases is to create 3 different pieces of documentation in order to get prepared for mediation. One is going to be a divorce position statement, and that's going to be basically your summary of the history of your marriage. It's going to be the key points that you want to discuss in the mediation or at trial. And then it's going to have a summary of the evidence to prove your position, as well as the offer or the settlement offer. And so, in order to get to a settlement offer, you need to list out all of your assets and all of your debts. That means you need pretty good records of what is even in those accounts. And if there's a business or a house, it means that you're also going to need to get an appraisal of those assets. And so if the other side isn't giving you the relevant data, like if you own a bunch of properties and they're not offering up the rent rolls or the information on the tenants, the cost per each particular property, then it's going to be pretty hard to determine what the value is of those properties. And so you might have to reach out and get like a CMA or an appraisal of the real estate. But even before then, how can you move forward? Well, with the business valuation, you're also going to need some historical financials. And this is typically what everybody is going to hold back, is the financials surrounding a rental property or the financials surrounding the business. Another area that you may need an appraisal is going to be in the pension valuation. So these 3 areas, if you don't have a value on them, then it's hard to come up with a full settlement offer. And so what we look at is, how do you have enough data? And do you have enough information to provide us with the basis of a value, even if it's not perfect? And that means that you might be doing some preliminary valuations in order to understand, like maybe you have one tax return. Maybe you have one document that gives you some indication of the rents for these properties or the expenses. Sometimes some of this information is actually on your personal tax return, like on the Schedule C. That could be some of the business information. Or you could have other documents within the tax return that are going to tell you about your rental properties. So that's the first start, is to see what you can gather from your personal tax return, which you should have access to. And if you don't have access, you would go back to the accountant that prepared that return and request a copy, not only in writing, but also in electronic format. And that is something that they would have to give to you because they created that document for you and your spouse, and that you have the right to a copy of that information. So that's your first starting point. Let's say you don't have enough information to come up with any of the valuations. Well, entering into mediation is maybe not going to be your best move at that point. You have to enter in with a settlement offer, or else you really don't have the capacity to finish in that mediation session. And some mediators may require that you book 8 hours of time with them. So you're going to book 8 hours of time. Maybe it costs, $2,000 to $3,000 for that mediation day, but you don't have all the values. And if you don't have all the values, how can you start to negotiate all of the pieces of this puzzle? So this is where we come in, and typically we're looking at a preliminary valuation. That means that you have to make some assumptions and you have to look at the financial picture and say, What do we think is possible here? Maybe you have a revenue number, right, for the business. Maybe we look at market multiples and figure out what the revenue multiple is. Now, that's not always the best way of valuing a business, but it's one indicator of value. So maybe you have one tax return or a K1. That could give us enough information to understand some of the cash flow to the business in order to determine a multiple of cash flow, or EBITDA, which is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. It's kind of like your net income, but we're adding back a few things that are typically non-cash, like depreciation, amortization, and taxes. So it's a pre-tax number. But again, you need some documentation to figure that out. Now, just because your lawyer can't figure it out from the documentation, that means that you need to get somebody that financially understands it as well. So we come in and put together a preliminary valuation, and then we're going to start to put together that settlement offer. And the settlement offer is usually a global settlement offer, which means it covers what's going to happen with all the assets, who's going to keep what, right? It's also going to have to deal with all the debts. And so who is going to keep those debts? Now, if there is some separate assets that are involved in this, an inheritance, a business that was started before the marriage and that was kept separate the entire marriage, then that person who claims that that is a separate asset is going to have to provide evidence and proof of the separate nature of that asset. So the burden of proof is on the person who says that it's separate. So if your spouse is sitting back and kind of in a toxic way saying you're going to get nothing because the business is separate and all of this is mine, have they provided you with evidence to prove that? Because they're going to have to prove it in court. So make them prove it now. Now, if they do provide you with some of that information, I would have a financial professional who understands divorce and understands how to trace separate assets to take a look and see if that proof is enough, because it is a legal position. And so this is where the expert and the lawyer are going to work together to see if there's enough proof in those documentation to say that this asset is separate. And when the asset is separate, it means that it kind of is removed from that balance sheet. And so that means that you put together all your assets and your debts, but you're not going to include that asset that's separate. Now, that also creates a situation where, do you know all of the assets and have they disclosed everywhere that there's cash or bank accounts or investments? And one way to determine that is to look at all the statements that you currently do have for accounts that are either business related or personally related, and see if there's any transfers or checks written to accounts that have not been disclosed. Now, again, that seems a little complicated, so you might have to get a professional involved, but you can start taking a look at least to see if there are any large transactions that are round numbers, okay? Or consistent numbers that are happening that are being transferred to, again, accounts or locations that you are not aware of. Now, this could be that you think that there, you saw something a few years ago that said an account had $1 million, and now you see something that says it only has 200,000. So what we may do is make an assumption and put that other $800,000 on your spouse's side and say that they had the benefit of that money. We don't know where it went, but we do know that it is missing. And for right now, we're going to put it on their side and say that they benefited from it, or they should prove out where it went. And so that means that we can make some assumptions about these key aspects of the business valuation, the pension valuation, the asset appraisals or the property appraisals, real estate, and even the marital waste. And all of these were done to just make some assumptions so that we could come to what a settlement offer would reasonably be. So you're making all the assumptions on the benefit of your side, essentially. Now, what that comes down to is you have a full picture, and now you have a full pie that you're trying to split in half. Now, that's just the beginning basis of separating out these assets and trying to understand what would reasonably be left for you to have in your side. And that settlement offer means that you want to start moving things around. Do you want to keep the house? Do you want some more retirement? Is everything going to be split down the middle? No, that's not how it works, unless you're going to sell those assets. And so if you're going to sell a house, then yes, it would be split down the middle and the equity is going to be split after expenses are paid. But if one person keeps it, it means it's going to move into their column. And so what that means is you need to have an idea of what your settlement offer looks like. Not only your best case, but your worst case. Like, what if everything falls onto their side and the judge would side with them and say, yes, this is a separate asset, or no, there's no marital waste. It was all spent on marital expenses, right? There was all spent on things for the family over time. So if you don't understand those two bookends, you don't understand your best case or your worst case, how do you go into mediation with a plan? It could still be that you're going into mediation because it's being forced by the court and you have a custody issue and you need to talk about some of the parenting plan or the ways that you're going to co-parent during this divorce process. What if the divorce process takes 6 to 12 to 18 months or 2 years and you're in limbo with the kids? That's not going to work too well. So initially, you might be with a mediator that's going to talk about your parenting plan. And I would encourage you to find a mediator that also understands some of the finances, especially if you have a complex situation. And so a good mediator might be a former judge that dealt with high conflict, high net worth divorces. And those mediators are probably going to cost a little bit more than your average mediator. Why is that important? They're going to give you an idea of what's going to happen in the court system. And mediation, at its minimum, should be a way for you to put forth your position as documented on that divorce position statement that you pulled together. Remember, it had your summary of your marriage to today's date. It had maybe a timeline of important events for the judge to know about. It also had the key top 3 issues that you wanted to talk about: kids, house, finances, and a little bit more details and evidence that you have prepared so that they could understand why your settlement offer really is a very reasonable starting point. And one of the things that we encourage is you do make the first offer. It's called anchoring the deal, or putting your first offer as your best offer forth first. And that means that everybody's going to negotiate off of that position. That means that they need to bring evidence and proof of why you are incorrect. And so if you don't have all the data and you maybe have some missing pieces, you're going in with that first offer that everybody thinks may be a little bit crazy, but they're then bringing documents to prove you wrong, which means all those missing documents that they didn't want to provide initially, they might actually bring to mediation, or the mediator could request it during the mediation for them to produce while they're there. That means that you go into mediation getting some of the documents that are missing, having them correct your position for the things that maybe you misunderstood or made assumptions that were in your benefit. It also means that it starts to expose their behavior, their toxic traits, and the ways that they are gaslighting everyone in this process. It means that you also are putting forth your position to the mediator as kind of a mock trial. So that means that wherever the mediator has issues with understanding your position or believing your position, you need to take notes and you need to make sure that you can provide additional documentation or strategy around that position. And maybe you need a little bit more compelling evidence and a way of presenting or strategy around those various issues. Now, best case, you've provided an offer, and when you go to mediation, even if they've ignored your offer, they are now coming to mediation with a counter offer. And that's where things start to move forward, where they counter your offer. And now you have your offer, which was your best situation, their counter offer may be coming close to what your worst situation was, right? If we've planned ahead and if we've run the numbers, you should have an idea of where they plan on coming. And quite frankly, with a toxic partner, they're probably going to come even lower. So, what that does is give you an idea of where their position is, what proof or evidence they have, especially if they're saying that things are separate. And it's going to force the mediator, as sort of the referee, to go in and get additional documents for you that would help either prove your position or provide some sort of check against your position. So, the other things that this also provides is that you are trying to gather information about their position, their way of proving this in court. And all of this information is going to be beneficial even if you don't settle the mediation on that day. That's why a lot of times we encourage you to do maybe 2 hours or 4 hours of mediation to start with instead of a full day, especially if you don't have information or you don't have everything together for a settlement offer. It means that you're forcing them to provide the documents. You're getting the mediator involved and saying, hey, can you guys provide and exchange these documents within the next 2 to 3 weeks? And then you're setting another mediation date in order to kind of have that arbitrary date that everybody is moving forward to, as opposed to waiting for trial and doing the same process just in front of a judge in a more formal capacity. So what happens if you go to mediation and it just blows up and nobody agrees? Then you're probably going to move forward with depositions, not only of your experts, but of you and your spouse. And so that would be the next part that you would get prepared for, is what are they going to ask you in that deposition? Well, you should, if you paid attention during the mediation, you should have identified their biggest issues, their biggest complaints or problems that they have with not only your behavior, your spending patterns, or the way that you have been parenting the kids. And you should be prepared for that deposition in the future. But quite frankly, in mediation, if you start mediation, a lot of times you can continue through with that mediation and that mediator for subsequent mediation meetings, which in a high conflict or high net worth divorce, you should assume that one mediation is not going to cut it, even if it's 8 hours. And if it is 8 hours, you need to have that offer prepared and exchanged with the other side well in advance of the mediation, so that when they come to mediation, they are presenting a counter offer. And now you have two different offers with which you are moving within, trying to come to somewhere in the middle and agree upon things. Even if you agree to some things in mediation, it doesn't mean that you have to sign on the dotted line at that time. It means that you've made some progress, you've set some things aside, and now you can focus on maybe more of the really volatile areas. And it could be the kids in the house, it could be the business value, or it could be those other issues: inheritance, missing assets, hidden money, or separate assets. So that kind of gives you a rough idea of how this is the process that we go through with every mediation that we're dealing with. You prepare your position statement, a settlement offer, and then you provide it to the other side. You go into mediation really trying to start negotiating those offers, not creating those offers while you're in the mediation. That's going to take too much time and probably waste through that entire day. So if you have any additional questions or want some, I guess, more tips about how to deal with a toxic spouse, follow our channel and watch while we interview other experts in this space. And this is one way that you can anchor the deal. So if you have more questions about these patterns that we see in divorce mediation, feel free to download Anchor the Deal or Power Moves in Divorce and start to take control of the process from your standpoint. So even if your team doesn't know how to negotiate in mediation, it doesn't mean that you can't lead this strategic kind of initiative. It means that there is a way to prepare to deal with mediation with a toxic spouse. It means that you can guide your team in that capacity, and we can assist you with prepping for mediation and getting your team ready for a strategy that really does equate to success at the end of those mediation sessions. So if you have more questions, please download one of our guides or our books about the theory, or book a session with us. It's 90 minutes, and we can really start to take a look at big picture. What is your strategy, and what are some of the ways that you can start to be prepared to really negotiate your way to settlement, as opposed to waiting for some trial date that's far off into the future with a judge that you really can't imagine what the outcome could be.